audience. I just want to say thanks to folks for coming. I know it's been a very hard few days for students in schools, for the teachers that support them, and also for the teachers who support the teachers who are supporting the students. So thanks for making the time to come. I have a probably inappropriately information dense set of slides for this time of day, but I want to spend relatively little time on the slides and then have lots of time, I hope, for conversation with Hanna, who's actually lived this work and made it happen school-wide in the school. And also for the rest of us, I think many people have used materials and would have know-how to share with other folks. So I'm thinking about 4 items. One is a brief background on school-wide lesson study and the evidence of its impact when it's used to support teaching through problem solving in mathematics. Second item is highlight online resources for lesson study and for teaching through problem solving. And then hear from Hanna, who when I first met her was a teacher at Acorn Woodland Elementary in Oakland Unified, and is now a literacy coordinator for Oakland District. And then finally, time for all of us to talk. So I think Melissa generously volunteered to copy these links into the chat so that if people want to play with things while I'm talking about them, they can do that. And I'm also happy to share the full PowerPoint so you've got these links. Because even though it's all from the same website, there are lots of little different facets to it that it might be quicker to be able to get to directly. So is that okay, Melissa? So, yeah, great, thanks. Okay, so what's school-wide lesson study? It's also sometimes called collaborative lesson research. That's another term that's used for the same thing. It's basically a practice that's universal in Japan, but it's really rare outside Japan. So in Japan, I've been to probably 75 elementary schools. I've never been to one that doesn't have school-wide lesson study. And basically it's at each grade level or grade band, or sometimes it's organized a little differently. Teachers participate in a lesson study team, and then they teach their research lesson to all the teachers in the school. All the teachers in the school watch it and use what's learned from that research lesson to incorporate into their own lesson study team's work. So even though you might just be involved in one planning cycle during a year, you might see 6 research lessons taught by your colleagues. And I'll say a little bit more about it in a moment. The work is guided by a shared research theme and theory of action developed by all the teachers in the school and refined by them over time to reflect what they've learned from their lesson study work. So I think that's important because it's not just individual teams working on something, but the teachers really coming together to say, well, what are all the qualities that we want our students to have when they graduate from our setting? And what are the things we can do as a faculty to nurture those qualities if we want them to be curious or, to love learning or whatever it is, be good problem solvers. And I think a third key feature of school-wide lesson study is that it uses, lesson study teams use knowledge from both inside the school and outside the school. And inside would be, for example, other teams' research lessons, what other teams have studied. And outside could be, for example, invited lesson commentators, outside research that the teachers read together. So this is just kind of an illustration of the idea of school-wide lesson study, that you've got these 3 elements that are in this sort of purple view. You've got blue, you've got the vision, the lesson study cycles, and the knowledge flow. And often schools will have a steering committee that's helping kind of strategize knowledge flow within the school. They'll typically draw on outside resources. So you've got all those things working together. It's kind of a cultural system of learning. Okay, so second big thing that I want to talk about is teaching through problem solving. What is that? It's the dominant method for teaching math and also science in Japan, and also some other subjects, social studies. The teaching gap called this method structured problem solving. So if you're familiar with the teaching gap, I'm talking about the same thing. Teaching through problem solving is a more literal translation of the Japanese. The big idea is that students build each new mathematical concept, or in the case of science, scientific concept or social studies concept, each new mathematical concept or procedure in the curriculum by solving a problem that requires it. Students have not previously been taught a solution method for the problem. And ironically and interestingly, teaching through problem solving originated in Japan in the 1980s in response to NCTM's agenda for action, which said problem solving should be the main focus of classroom life in the United States. And so they saw that report and really took it to heart in Japan. It was also influenced by Korea's problem solving, how to solve it. Okay. And perhaps the best English language work on teaching mathematics through problem solving is Akihiko Takahashi's book, which is cited at the bottom here. He taught elementary and lower middle school in Japan for about 20 years before becoming a teacher educator in the US. So he's really an expert from many sides on this. So this is kind of a visual description of teaching through problem solving from Akihiko. And so you have the problem, different students in the class, try different methods, come up with different methods to solve it. So for example, if they're confronting adding fractions with different denominators for the first time, some students might think about drawing a number line and using that to break up, say, a half plus a third break them both up into 6. Some other kids might see the problem a half plus a third and decide to do it by adding a half and a third and getting 2/5. And that might be one of the solutions chosen for discussion. And kids might look at that solution and say, gee, that seems like it should work. Why doesn't it work? So a whole lesson would be spent on the problem. What Akihiko calls this solution presentation, he calls that show and tell. And he's fond of saying that many US lessons end with this show and tell. Whereas Japanese teachers say that the real lesson begins with this last part. It's called neriage, and which literally means kneading, like kneading bread, or sometimes translated as polishing. That it's that process where students really build their mathematical ideas, that comparing and discussing. And a fair amount of the lesson, maybe 20 minutes or so, is devoted to that discussion in which kids go from whatever idea they started with to solve the problem to the new mathematical understanding. And you can imagine a similar process in science or social studies, or occasionally it's used in language arts as well. Okay, so why are there teaching through problem solving materials at a lesson study site? Lesson study is a tool to transform routines of teacher learning, but we also need a powerful vision of student learning. And one of the things we began to realize when we were doing research in US classrooms is that teachers really embraced and did powerful work with the teacher learning routines of lesson study, but often the materials they had to support student learning were really inadequate. So for example, something like 15% of the Japanese teacher's edition in mathematics is devoted to unpacking student thinking in mathematics. What are students going to be thinking, anticipating their thinking? Very little of the US teacher's manual is devoted to that. And so we started looking at materials for introducing powerful vision of student learning in mathematics. And we chose mathematics because we have such problems teaching mathematics in the United States compared to other countries. I don't like to talk in a deficit mentality, but I think, compared to the teaching of other subjects, it's often much less advanced, much less building from students' curiosity, involving students, making all students think that it's interesting and valuable. So what's hard about teaching through problem solving? It's probably obvious, but it's very challenging. Teachers must know the mathematics very deeply, like mathematicians know it, so that they can grasp mathematics in the flow of students' ideas, in the rapid flow of classroom life. And often teachers need to give up comfortable routines like I do, we do, you do. If you're used to demonstrating how to, say, add fractions with different denominators, you learn how to do that beautifully, perfectly, explain it to kids, maybe give very deep explanations. But that's very different from students drawing on their own prior knowledge to try and invent a method themselves and then discovering either that method works or doesn't. So we used a school-wide lesson study in about a half dozen collaborating schools in San Francisco, Oakland, California, and Chicago. We asked the schools what they wanted to focus on, and about a half dozen of them wanted to focus on mathematics. So we introduced teaching through problem solving. And I would say that the materials at the website really should be described as collaboratively developed with the teachers at these sites, because we saw what was working for them, what wasn't, what they asked for, and built the materials. This is one of the elementary schools, and the demographic here is typical of its historically underserved students by and large. And I will show you so that you notice who the population is, and then look at before you look at the test scores. This is their SBAC scores, and I don't know how many of you are in states that use Smarter Balanced Assessment, but it's a very challenging test, unlike some standardized tests. It's what, 3.5 or 4 hours long, I think. It has a substantial problem solving component where students are asked to solve problems they haven't seen before. And the black lines you can see are the San Francisco Unified School District scores. We've got the populations here from left to right. We have just Muir, the school, John Muir Elementary, the school. The next block of color is the African American students, then Hispanic Latino students, the English language learners, and then the final right-hand block is the students with low socioeconomic, low household incomes. And you can see that those schools, the children from those demographic groups in the district as a whole showed relatively flat performance on SBAC over the 5 years from the left-hand column, which was the year before we started school-wide lesson study with teaching through problem solving, to the 4th year of the work. So take a moment to really kind of internalize that. Are there any questions about, is the figure fairly clear? I think it takes a moment to really think about what is it like for an African American or Hispanic Latino English language learning student at Muir School versus in the district as a whole. I mean, they have a very different, probably life preparation for going on to the next phase of education. One of the things I'd like you to notice in this too is the sort of darker blue column at the very left is the year before we introduced school-wide lesson study and teaching through problem solving, which was really built through the efforts of the classroom teachers in each school. That was the year before. The red is the first year teachers were trying that. And for most groups, in most of the slides we'll see, achievement on the SBAC actually went down the first year, which is quite consistent with teachers really trying to reorganize their practice in a profound way. But it's also not something that a lot of school districts expect, anticipate, or willing to support. So we're very grateful to our colleagues in Oakland and San Francisco for being willing to persist through that. So now I'm going to show you, this is another San Francisco school, also did school-wide lesson study and teaching through mathematics, teaching through problem solving. They started with, in general, a much lower achievement profile than the first school I showed you, but very similar pattern of tremendous growth in those historically underserved groups. So take a minute. Let you look at that. And then the next slide is from a different district, Oakland. It's the school that Hanna taught at. Very much the same profile of relatively static or slightly increasing in the district as a whole, but dramatic increases at the school in children's SBAC performance. And I have to say, we did not go about this work wanting to increase standardized test scores. We read about the work wanting to increase the routines for meaningful learning that were available to teachers to learn from practice, from students, from colleagues, wanting to support teachers in their goals, which were typically things like supporting self-confident, curious, problem-solving learners. Those were determined at each site by the teachers. And so we weren't looking at standardized test scores particularly. And when we looked at them about 3 years in, we were really stunned by these results, which occurred in all the schools that were using SBAC. They did not occur, interestingly, in the Chicago schools where they gave something called the MAP test 4 times a year, which was a hour-long kind of multiple choice fill in the blanks test. Okay, so the latter part of the presentation is I just want to acquaint you visually with some of the website resources. So this is the home page, and you can see there are 2 ways to get to the Teaching Through Problem Solving resources. One is circled there in red, and the other is if you hit the resources button, which is in gray, then underneath it are both resources for Teaching Through Problem Solving and for school-wide lesson study. And there's video there of school-wide lesson study sites doing large public lessons. If you're not familiar with lesson study, there's a whole section of resources here that's about lesson study. In that about lesson study, there's a kind of overview that talks about what happens during each phase of lesson study. Why lesson study? I think Hanna's in part of the video for this, but a number of her colleagues definitely from Acorn Woodland are. It's about its teachers and others' reflections on how lesson study has changed their schools. Brief video clips if you're looking to sort of explore what it feels like for educators. So there's the 6-minute video you can get by clicking on that video box. And then teacher learning, and this I'll take a minute to talk about because I think a lot of us are researching lesson study. And this is just a very, our initial thinking about it, but I'd really love feedback. But this section on teacher learning, there are 3 different kind of frameworks for thinking about, for reflecting on, is our lesson study working? The first is lesson study phase. The next is growth dimensions, things like, am I growing in my knowledge? Am I growing in my practice? Am I growing in my beliefs about that support productive learning? And then the third is knowledge integration, which is a framework for thinking about how does our knowledge change? So all of those are attempts to kind of capture, for those of us trying to evaluate lesson study, how do we capture the progress we're making in a way that maybe will help us reflect on it? So and I don't think those are used much, and I'd love feedback on them. So there are 3 different theoretical frameworks or tools for reflecting on lesson study progress. They include questions for reflecting on each of the phases. A second section is conduct a cycle. I won't go through this, but it's meant to be step-by-step support for conducting a lesson study cycle. And that may be of use to you in kind of, as a reflecting on your own process. Are there things you want to add or subtract or edit? There's also a brief, you can download this whole step-by-step as a brief handbook if you want to do that. You can download a 1-page overview. So the step-by-step support is divided into these phases of prepare your team, study, plan, teach, reflect. There are videos of US and Japanese teachers conducting lesson study. Those can again be nice if you're wanting to explore this with colleagues. I think one of the places that has been useful, which really developed out of watching the schools conduct their lesson study work, is this first stage of the study in the cycle, studying research, curriculum materials, standards. This is from a teacher at Muir Elementary who talked about how the idea of studying the whole unit, what's the whole purpose of the unit, really changed her planning as a teacher. And I think that's one of the things we're all aiming for, is that lesson study isn't something that you do it and it's done, but it's something that really changes your daily habits of planning and thinking about instruction. So that's a quote from her, continuation of the quote. that she shifted her planning really from thinking about what am I supposed to say today, which is what's included in her curriculum, to what are my goals for the lesson and the unit. And under the teaching through problem solving section, you'll find, that discussion part where children's ideas are being built into the new mathematical understanding. That really requires making students' thinking visible. And in teaching through problem solving, teachers do that through children's reflective math journals, through using the board as a very strong visual resource, through discussion. And resources for all of those are included in the TTP section. So for example, here's an example of a way to build a reflective mathematics journal translated from the Japanese curriculum. There are lots of examples of discussion. So for each phase of the lesson, what are the big points of the discussion? What are teachers trying to accomplish? And what are examples of teacher questions? And each of these has video from kindergarten, second grade, and fifth grade classrooms, video of actual classroom instruction, and also teachers reflecting on why they use that particular type of questioning. So you click on those boxes to see these quick videos. There are also about 25 teaching through problem solving lesson videos from K-5, and some of them have unit plans, lesson plans, post-lesson discussions, or pre-lesson discussions accompanying them. Another way to get started are these free self-paced online courses. There's one on trying math journals, one on developing the role of a final commentator, which if a lot of us are university-based might be something of interest to you, conducting a lesson study cycle on fractions. Here are links to the final commentator resources. And then there are additional kinds of resources, science resources, what you might need to work on school-wide lesson study. Some questions we've used for people to explore the school-wide lesson study and teaching through problem-solving resources. And I can't resist doing a shameless self-promotion for World Association of Lesson Study. If any of you have never been, it's a wonderful gathering of teachers and university-based folks from 35 plus countries, and we'll be meeting in Hiroshima next November, which should be really fun because it's the birthplace of lesson study, and it's a good chance to exchange your knowledge. So I want to stop sharing my screen at this point and invite Hanna to add her thoughts.
Catherine, can I ask you a question, please?
Sure.
All right. So as a minority teacher in the United States, are there tests that can be given that are different for minority students, or are they presented with the same test? Because as I teach in Atlanta, Georgia, and a majority of my students are minority students. And so when they're being assessed, they're put on these certain parameters, but is it the same test that is being given to all of the students?
Yeah, such an important question. I'm gonna sort of pass it on to others, but I'll give one, because I think there are people who know more about that in this group than I do, but I'll give one comment to start, which is, I thought it was very interesting that this very challenging test, the SBAC, picked up the improvements from deep changes in instruction for students. And we haven't done one-to-one analyses, but the students from historically discriminated groups or historically marginalized groups were looking very similar to white middle-class kids on this very challenging assessment with very high quality instruction. In other districts where they were using other standardized tests at the state level, that was not the case. So I think it tells us a little something about how language facility, cultural background may enable you to game some kinds of tests better than other kinds of tests. And I don't know what's being used in your setting, but I'm going to pass that off. I know there are other people on this call that probably know more about this than I do. Anyone else want to share some thoughts for Coach P?
Maybe in the interest of time, we can have both of you should finish your contributions, and then we can open it for other questions too. Hanna, if you want to share.
Yeah, great. Hi everyone, my name is Hanna. I, as Catherine mentioned, taught at Acorn Woodland, one of the schools whose data you saw on those slides, showing the really incredible growth. Sort of made my heart flutter to see that again. And in general, I am a bit of an evangelical for lesson study and teaching through problem solving. And I was as a teacher, and now that I am doing district level work, and I was also a school leader, so have really just expanded my bird's eye view of the challenges of changing teacher practice. I just become increasingly so. So what I can tell you is that everything Catherine has shared is really true. Everything that you see on that website, when done really well, can be transformative. And so if it all sounds really fabulous, like, oh yeah, this will happen, I did experience that happening through all of the resources and steps that Catherine described. And I think as researchers and educators in the classroom in this group, we all know that having professional learning for teachers that actually changes teacher practice is extremely rare, right? For that 1 hour of the week when you come together with your team to actually truly impact kids' growth and how you teach and make it significantly better. I don't know, the researchers in the room can tell me the statistic, but I would say 95% of the time doesn't really happen. We might think a lot of our PDs are transformational, and yet it doesn't, it rarely shows up in student growth. And I experienced the process feeling transformational, my instruction feeling transformed, and my student data transformed. So when I am working with groups of teachers and principals from the district level now, and there's a lot of skepticism about professional learning being worth people's time and really pushing for it to be a really deep experience, I'm constantly referencing my lesson study experience because it is pretty singular as a narrative of, yes, PD can be an experience that will change every last teacher in your school's practice. So I just wanted to start from that place. I wanted to share, and I apologize that I don't have slides, but I wanted to share just a few details about why it felt so transformational. So one is the intellectual piece. It's pretty rare that we as elementary school teachers feel that the professional learning we're a part of is like really pushing our brains. That we as math teachers, I was a 4th grade math teacher, that I was sitting with materials that were helping me think extremely deeply about every little teaching move and every little idea that my students might have about a fraction. And then the value of the collaboration, right? We're all chasing after quality teacher collaboration. Well, lesson study is built on that premise, and we happen to have a stellar team that all loved each other, but a lot of our professional learning hadn't felt collaborative despite that. And then when we got into lesson study and we were all around a table together, it was the first time that it felt like we were making growth truly collaboratively. And that was following the lesson study model. We also had such a laser focus. So as Catherine mentioned, TTP as the teaching approach that you are working toward in lesson study gave us all something to work toward together, a way of advancing our math instruction. And so coming together to do lesson study, knowing that that was what we were trying to get better at with that really laser focus, meant that everything else got pushed to the side. And as you saw, not overnight, but over several years of pushing everything to the side, which we all know is also very hard to do at a school site, we did transform our teaching practice, and we did get there. And it wasn't just one person, it was all of us who were involved in the lesson study. And lesson study and TTP offers these incredible structures. So we didn't have to read endless books and dig into a daily curriculum to understand how to get better at TTP, but we needed to learn the very concrete structures that are all detailed on that great website. So once we got to see examples and got to really understand the structure of teaching through problem solving, we could dig in right away. It didn't require a year of learning a curriculum in the same way it might with others. And then lesson study is very structured. So we were not grabbing at random examples on the internet to understand what to do. It was very clear from the get-go. And I'll add to that for those of you who are at universities, the experience of having Catherine and her team from Mills come in and say, we believe in all of you and we're here to support you, and how can we make this intellectual experience more valuable for you, and we're going to help find grants to make this happen, and then we're going to bring in others to watch you teach and celebrate you. The empowerment that came from feeling seen in that way and having that university partnership was unparalleled. We all felt like we were a part of the research process and we were supported. And we were a school that got a lot of attention and a lot of random supports because we had a great principal and he sought those out. But the experience with Mills, the partnership, was just unlike anything we had experienced before. As you can see that Catherine and I are still in touch, even though she's doing totally different things and I'm doing totally different things. And then the last thing I'll say is it was fun. And that, right, professional learning that's great usually has that in the mix. And that's related to having the Mills team supporting us. That's related to it feeling collaborative. That's related to the laser focus because we were not as stressed out as you might be when it feels like there's 20 things to accomplish. And we building up to the lesson and knowing that it was going to be this big day and we all had each other's backs and we were so excited to see how it went after all this hard work. There's a lot of fun that comes with that. So that was my experience as a teacher. And then I went into a school leader role and took my time in pushing this idea of lesson studies, a very, very different school, with a team of teachers that was not as collaborative and not as in love with working with one another. And took it really, really slow with starting with individual teachers and directing them to that website. And there were teachers who felt like they wanted to be teaching math in a different way. And that is where I started if I'm giving you the feedback that you're talking way too much during the math lesson and how can you elevate student voice? And they're saying, I don't know how to do that. Teaching through problem solving is such an amazing pathway because it is the ultimate kids as the leaders of their own learning math process. It's all about student voice. And I don't know about all of your districts, but in Oakland, we are just obsessing over trying to figure out how to shift the ratio of teacher talk to student talk. And teaching through problem solving did that for me. And it did that for a number of teachers that I've worked with, where because the structure is so different, you're no longer saying to yourself, like, let me make it into a turn-in talk instead of me talking at them. It's not itty-bitty fixes like that. It's the overall way you're teaching is all about kids up at the board explaining to their peers. And so you truly step back and you are watching it happen. You're involved, you're making it happen, but you're also watching it happen. And so in the 4th grade where the kids were, really up to that challenge, but hadn't really been offered that challenge before, it was incredible. And then when you see kindergartners up at the board explaining a math situation to their peers, that just is like even more just radical and makes you want to cry, right? It's it's just a beginning of a completely different learning journey, as Catherine said. So I have not replicated the experience I had at Acorn Woodland. That was a unique school and a unique team, but I have brought pieces of teaching through problem solving to teachers ready for it. And I have brought aspects of the collaboration and the structure and the approach to lesson study to schools looking to have more meaningful professional learning. And now I'm focused on literacy and doing a lot of different experiments with how I can take lessons from that experience to the literacy work that we're doing as a district. And I would say that it has to be all in for it to really be what we did at Acorn Woodland. And I don't feel like we're replicating. I wish that my next step had been to go to a school that was then ready to do the same thing, and I could say that now Oakland is doing it in every school. That didn't happen. And the system-wide change is not there. But there are a lot of lessons that stick with me. So I want to close with just a couple thoughts around what you can be thinking about, particularly if you are in a leadership role at a university. The university support was, as I mentioned, integral. And so if you are feeling like you want a way to be working with the school more, supporting a lesson study process felt like the ideal way for us to be partnering with a research team. And so highly recommend like pushing through the red tape to make that happen. The other thing is half the reason this worked for us was our principal and him saying, we're going to really commit to this for 3 to 5 years. And that pushing to the side of other things, that was him. And him saying, let's have fun with this. A lot of those reasons why it worked so well was his stamping of it from the get-go. And so if you're thinking about like first steps, it's really getting a principal to say to their team, like, we're about to shift the way we do professional learning. We're about to maybe shift the way we teach math. And like, let's go all in. And I will shepherd the way for you. And then the last thing I'll say is the power of the space for experimentation. So like that first year when the data dips, right? We were not good at teaching through problem solving that first year. And we had so many flops, so many lessons where the kids were, asked to try out different strategies in their journals and they just stared at us blankly because they had not done that before. And so the space to try it out and play and experiment both from the kids' angle and from the teacher's angle was so powerful. And you have to leave space for the discomfort of change. But as someone who like actually experienced radical change that is so rare, I can say that many times we try to make space for that change and we're not truly open to the experimentation, right? And to the dip in the data. And I, having come through it and come out the other side, realized that without that space, we never would have gotten to where we got. So just putting a plug out there for like the openness to that. So I'll leave it there. I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for sharing about your experiences. I'm not sure we have time for a question, maybe one question. But thank you so much for sharing about your experience.